welcome back to Reading the Decades with me. And today we're gonna do my big February wrap up. I've read 16 books in February, and today is the 29th, so maybe I can fit in another book. Maybe I can finish another book tonight. I'm not sure about that yet. But let's talk about all the nice books I've read this month. Also, what I think about is that if I continue to read that much during the next month as well, maybe I split up my wrap up into 2 videos, or I film like a wrap up after the first 2 weeks of the month and then a part 2 after the second 2 weeks of the month, because it's just so many books and it's quite a long time since I've read them. Although it's just like barely 4 weeks, it feels like much longer, especially when you read that much. You gather so much information, and it all at a point gets a bit jumbled up in your mind. I write notes to every book I read, but still I think it's much easier to talk about books straight after you've read them, or like quite close to the time when you've read them. So yeah, maybe in the future I do 2 monthly wrap-ups in a month, each for 2 weeks. It's so hard to decide where to start now, because well, I've put the books into little categories again. So maybe we start with the non-fiction this time. So quite at the beginning of the month I read Helen Taylor's Why Women Read Fiction, The Stories of Our Lives, which is about basically Helen Taylor put together a questionnaire with lots of different questions about reading, sent it out to I think 400 or 500 women she knew, women who read in a book club, old women, young women, and then with the answers she got, she put together this book. But quite a problem I had straight away with the book was that she didn't define what a woman is, or she didn't define what kind of women she asked, or she sent her questionnaire to. So we don't know if she bases her research on women who on people who define as women, or if they have to be if their sex has to be female, or if their gender is female. I have no idea, and I was a bit confused throughout the book, because she gave several explanations for different sexualities, and she really got into like the different ethnicities and different backgrounds of her of the readers she sent her questionnaire to, but she never really defined or she never really gave a definition of what woman means in this book. Also, I couldn't really find myself represented in this book, like lots of quotations and lots of the end result and lots of the answers she got were based on experiences by middle-aged women or older women even. Yeah, and they were quite like stereotyped, cliche older women. You would see like your grandmother joining a book club in her neighborhood, and they talk about like the latest romance novels and they try classic but they don't like it, or I don't know. It really focused on an age group, although she included some younger women in there, but it really focused on one particular type of women, really, age group wise, and also like in their background, in their social background, and where they grew up and where they live now, and what their family is and what their sexuality is. And yeah, so it would have been so much more interesting if she would have included more examples of more diverse women. Also, what I noticed is that she or the answers she got mainly focused on reading as escapism and not really close reading, academic reading. So yeah, I think it was quite lacking, and I couldn't really feel myself represented there as a millennial, as an academic reader. It was interesting to read, but it definitely could have been much better. Straight after this I read C.S. Lewis, An Experiment in Criticism, which was very good to read straight after Why Women Read Fiction. This is basically where C.S. Lewis sets a scenario where there aren't any bad books in the world, but only bad readers or bad ways of reading books. So it really focused on readers who use books for escapism or for inserting themselves into certain stories and start daydreaming about them, and academic readers basically who do or who focus on the close reading technique, who reread books, who keep thinking about books. So it really focuses on readings and readers instead of books itself. Sometimes it read a bit snobbish, but then in other parts it was really humble again, so it had a good mixture. And also it is quite old, I think it is from 1960, so it was very interesting to read it in the context of its time when it got first published and when C.S. Lewis has written it, and then also in comparison to 2020 or the 20th century basically. Especially if you think about the influences of the market, of publishing business, social media, how we talk about books in 2020 instead of 1960. So yeah, it was very interesting, and it is more like a cataclysm to start your own thoughts on reading and to start your own thoughts on what actual context goes around reading a book. Then a book that does not necessarily focus on reading but rather on writing books is Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, Instructions on Writing and Life. Anne Lamott is an author, and in this book she talks about her life, how her life inspired her to write, about her struggles as an author, and also she gives helpful insights and tips for aspiring writers. So it is part memoir and part writing advice. This book is quite a few years old. I think it got published in the early 90s, in 1994, but it established itself as a very influential book on writing, I assume, because it's still around, and it got published as one of the canons by Canongate, where they publish like quite influential books to certain topics. So I had quite high hopes for that one. I marked a few things where I thought, oh yeah, that is quite helpful. She is true to the bone. She says, yeah, writing is hard, but writing can also be fun. She gives good tips, nothing too controversial or new. It's more like in the sense of a self-help book where you, as a reader, actually already know the answers. They already lie within you, but you have to get it told by somebody else. On the other hand, it had quite problematic language in it, especially when she gave descriptions of disabled people. There was a very bad comparison to autistic people in there. I think 2 times it was, and yeah, so there is problematic language in here, and I think if I could revise this book a bit and update it a bit for 2020 readers instead of readers from 1994, I think it would be a bit better. Another memory I read was Tracy Thorn's Another Planet. This book gives a portrait of the green belt that surrounds London. It talks about London's suburbias and its relation to the big city, and it talks about how it is experienced as a teenager, when the author was a teenager herself in the 70s and 80s. So most of what we learn is gathered from her diaries and from her memories, how she remembered growing up as a teenager in suburbia of the 70s and 80s. But she also gives quite nice background information of how the green belt came into existence around London, and she goes not really into detail, but she gives a very good overview of what suburban areas really are, what kind of image we have of them, what their relation is to the city back in the 70s and also these days. And she also not only focused on her experience as a teenager, but she gives now as an adult a reflection on that, and also she gives a reflection of why her parents, who were the war generation, wanted to move where they moved, and how she as a teenager was absolutely opposed to that, but how she can understand this as a mother and a middle-aged woman in 2020 now. And also on the other hand, because Tracy Thorn is a musician, it focused a bit, or it gave an insight into a woman's place in rock and roll in the 70s and 80s. It doesn't focus on that so much, but it gives little hints here and there, and it also talks about how that stands in relation to living in suburbia. So a really nice, short, brief memoir with quite interesting facts woven into it. Okay, something a bit more light-hearted before we go back to the hard stuff. In February, I read 2 books by Neil Gaiman, and I wish I would have read both of them when I was way younger, like not maybe 20 years back, but 18 years back. They were both not written for children, and but still, I still would have really enjoyed them, I think, as a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old. I came around reading them now, and I quite really enjoyed them. The first one I read was Neverwinter, the illustrated edition, which follows Richard Mayhew, who falls through the cracks and ends up in a London below, where he has to go on a mission with a girl that can open doors, and with a marquis who seems a bit dubious and shady at times. And I really enjoyed this hero's journey story. So although some parts of it and some use of language isn't really for children, I still would have really enjoyed that as a child, because that was my main time in my life where I was reading lots of fantasy and was really interested in those type of stories that were like fantasy related to cities, especially to London. So this book, although I've never read it as a child, gave me a really big nostalgic feeling. It is obviously set in, I don't know, when was it published? I think in 1990 or 1996, so it is set in the 90s, so it gave me this really big nostalgic feeling, and I absolutely loved the book for that. And you also learn about London, although this is a fiction novel obviously, but Neil Gaiman has a very nice ability to weave mythology into his books. So this book was basically giving the brief mythology of London as a town, and how it developed, and although he didn't give lots and lots of facts, it was really interesting to read it. And I as an adult reader now, I wish he would have included more of those facts and those myths. And yeah, basically this book is not only a story, a good fantasy story, it's also a description of a town and its citizens. So yeah, I can really recommend especially this illustrated edition, because it's just so pretty. And it's also called the author's preferred text, because first he has written it for this story was first a television series, which I still have to watch, and then he reworked it into a novel, and then there was the British edition, and then he put out an American edition because he had to give lots and lots of annotations for American reader who wouldn't understand the Britishness or the Englishness of it that he put in here. So I'm really interested also in comparing this version with the other ones, I think. And then the other book I read by him that he has co-written with Terry Pratchett was Good Omens. I also still have to watch the television adaptation of that one, which I'm very excited for, because this book was so funny. This one is from 1990, I think, so it also has quite some dated aspects in it. Basically, this book is about a demon and an angel who mess up quite a few things and have to work together because Armageddon is near. The world is supposed to only live for another week, and this is the week leading up to this big event. They both want to prevent this, although they both have instruction not to prevent this event, because Armageddon has to happen, because it is written in prophecies, it is written in the Bible. And something happened at the beginning which leads to quite a journey and some confusion, and they have to find the son of the they have to find the son of the devil, the Antichrist. And yeah, it was hilarious. It was very funny. It has lots and lots of characters in it. Like, sometimes I was a bit like, oh, and also you don't really like all of the characters, so some parts I was a bit like reluctant to read because I didn't like them that much. It had a lot of build-up, which I thought like was really funny, and I was really looking forward to the big showdown, which was a bit disappointing because it wasn't the big showdown I was hoping for. And also there were some things that happened that well, they were a bit disappointing in a way that I wouldn't have imagined them to happen like this, especially like decisions certain characters made. They were really well, it felt a bit rushed in the end to me. It felt a bit like, oh, we don't have time anymore to explain certain actions, so the characters just do them without any explanation, and we have to trust them on that, why they're doing that. So yeah, it was a bit, they'd take a bit of the easy route at some points, but nevertheless I laughed out loud quite a few times, and I really hope that the telly show is as funny as the book was. Everything else I've read in February is quite serious business, so let's continue with that. A really good one that I've read and that I can highly recommend is John Williams' Stoner. This is the story of William Stoner, who grew up in agricultural environment, gets sent to university where he discovers his love for literature and for teaching, and it follows him throughout his career as a university student, as a teacher, as a family father. So it's quite a classic novel. I think it was published in the 1960s as well, yeah, 1965. So it is quite a classic novel of university life, but it really focuses on the love of teaching literature and bringing knowledge to students. And as a teacher, obviously, that was really lovely to read. It is a very sad story. It is very depressing at parts. Lots and lots of things go wrong in Stoner's life, and although it is sad to read about them, he never loses the joy and the love he has for literature and teaching. Those are the things that keep him going, and he really believes in them and in himself as an advocate of those two things. So basically this joy is the most uplifting part of this novel. It also says it has like loose connections to John Williams' own life. So I'm interested in reading up on that and see where the similarities are. What I really enjoyed about John Williams was his very clear prose and his very clear language he used to write this book, basically, and that made me want to read definitely more of his work. I really want to read all of what he has written and see if he continued, or yeah, if all of his books are written in this very nice language. So this book is basically about family, about friendship, about love, about having a career, and because it is from basically the birth until the end of William Stoner, it's not surprising that there is going to be a death scene at the end, and it was so beautifully written. I think I've never read a better death scene before in all of my life. Like, if you ever have to read about a death scene, if you ever want to gather inspiration on it, if you ever have to read, I don't know, if you ever have to encounter a written death scene in fiction, read the one in Stoner, because it was just absolute fantastic. And wow, John Williams has like an amazing use of language. Then I started this big one here, Roberto Bolaño's 2666, which I included in my big books video. And actually what I found out while reading this is that the author intended to publish this book in 5 parts. So it didn't really count as one of my big books then. I didn't know that before. In the end though, his children and his publisher decided to publish all 5 parts at once. So it ended up being a big book. So it's a bit controversial. So either you can read it in its 5 parts on its own, or you read it in one go. I've read the first part of it, which is called the part about the critics, which was about 160 pages. The book is supposed to be about crimes that happen at the US-Mexican border. The first part that I've read was a complete build-up to this. Only in the end, the story shifted to being set at the, or not even at the border, but in Mexico. In the first part, we get to know a group of literature professors from the UK, from Italy, from Spain and from France, who all focus on, who all focus in their research on one certain German author. And the whole first part basically revolves around the relationship of those critics to each other and their search for that mysterious author, because nobody has seen him for the last couple of decades, and they're really like under the influence of this, or they really mystify this weird mystery German author. So it was really interesting to read. It is quite an analogy for comparative literature, I would say, because obviously they all have a different view on how they read this German author's work from whatever country they come from, what their literary background was and all of that. So it was really interesting to read that. And then in the end they find out that maybe that author might be in Mexico and they travel there all together. And this is basically where it ends. And I have decided to not read further at the moment, because to me it is a summer book, and I explained in an earlier video that I'm very much a season reader. So as much as I enjoyed the first part, I will wait and finish this book during the summertime, because I think I'll get a lot more atmosphere out of it if I wait a few more months. Then, surprise, surprise, a book that I did not enjoy, although like the whole world loves it, and that is Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend, the first book in the Neapolitan novels. This book is about Elena and, is it her name, Laila? Yeah, I think so, Laila, who grew up in 1950s Naples, and it is described on the cover as a Bildungsroman. And yeah, I can see why that is. It is about the education of those two girls. It is about their relation to each other, to the environment they grow up in, and their two very different paths to education. And it was okay. I don't have anything bad to say about it. I really liked the language in this. I don't know if it was due to Elena Ferrante or to her translator. I really enjoyed a very clear prose. It was very engagingly written. It's a nice and easy language, and also has very, very short chapters, so you can read this book. I think it has nearly 400 pages. Well, it has over 300 pages. And you can really eat it, yeah, I eat my books. You can really read it in one afternoon, basically, because of those short chapters, because of that easy language. But then again, it had so many repetitions in my opinion. There were so many things that got mentioned again and again and again, and there were so many events that happened again and again and again, and it follows Laila and Elena from being girls to being teenagers, or quite advanced teenagers. And yeah, book one, it's called Childhood Adolescence, so it follows them during their childhood and adolescence, and it was a bit too long for that, so you could have taken out a few parts of what happened. I thought the protagonist, Elena, a bit boring. Like, she didn't have a strong character arc. She didn't really have a big development during her childhood and adolescence. Obviously, this being the first book in 4, only really is a setup for what is to follow. So it is a bit controversial to say or to moan about it without having read the other ones, but I mean, it still is a book on its own. So yeah, wasn't really satisfied with her development, or her lack of development, basically. Nevertheless, what I thought positive about it was a very nice and fitting portrayal of a neighborhood. Yeah, I can't really say anything more about that. It was okay. I didn't really enjoy it. I didn't like the protagonist. There weren't any likable characters in this one. It had a few moments where I was like, oh yeah, it's getting better now. I'm getting more involved. I'm getting more interested. But then it kind of lost me again. So I don't think I'm going to read the second book in this series, but because I really, really enjoyed Elena Ferrante's language and writing style, I'm definitely going to read her other works that don't evolve around those Neapolitan novels. And there's also a non-fiction work of her where she talks about writing, I think. And I'm really intrigued by that one. So I don't give up on her. It's just like this story just wasn't for me. A book that I just recently, or kind of recently got, is Beloved by Toni Morrison. I said I wouldn't read this for a while, but then I decided to pick it up nevertheless. Wow, this book was quite a read, and I can't really say too much about it, or there's so much to say, and it keeps me a bit like it's easier to write about it because you can gather your thoughts a bit better. So it is set in the mid-1800s, and slavery comes to an end. It is about a female slave. She's free now, she lives on her own now, but she still obviously suffers from trauma. It's about her living in the society of ex-slaves and people who want to end slavery. But it is also a ghost story about the baby she killed during her life coming back into her life as a grown teenager now. So I've written, I think the best part to describe it at the moment, or to talk about it, is just reading out my notes that I've written down. Powerful language and story, yes, definitely. The language used in this one is amazing. Wow, I've never read, I think, a Toni Morrison before, and that use of language just blew me away. And the story, this is such a creepy, terrifying, sad story. All the horrors of being a slave, the horrors of killing your own child to protect it from slavery, and then that child coming back, and wow, it's so spooky, like one of the most spookiest book I've ever read. So the horror works in two ways. First, we have the true horror of history and slavery, obviously, and also the horror of killing your own baby. And then we have the horror of the supernatural, where the baby comes back. So you have different ways basically to read this novel. Do you read it as a horror novel? Do you read it as a historical novel? Do you read it as a literary fiction novel? It's like very, very interesting under what aspect and under what genre aspect you want to read the book. What else did I note? Context of slavery and slavery for the individual. Yeah, it is not so much about slavery in historical matters, but really what effects it had on an individual person, which I found quite interesting to read about. I never really read anything about that. Obviously, coming in contact with slavery is mostly on a non-fiction ground, where you read about it in history books or in non-fiction books. So roving that into an individual person's experience, really powerful. There is a discourse about the masters, because where she grew up, her master was kind of a good master. Although they were treating their slaves good, they were still like having slaves. So controversial, a very controversial discourse about that. And it's also a ghost story that is in a way more than a ghost story, because you can be haunted in more than one way. You can be haunted not only by a ghost, but also by trauma and your own experiences, and by history. And yeah, so wow, this is definitely a book you have to read many, many more times to get its full potential. And I really want to read up on everything, every academic text around this one, because I think that could be really, really interesting topic. Another quite depressing book was George Orwell's 1984. which tells the story of Winston Smith, an ordinary man struggling against the overwhelming power of a totalitarian state. Yeah, I don't know, I'm probably the last person on earth who has read 1984, but finally I did. I really enjoyed it. It was so depressing. Oh my god, was it depressing. I really love George Orwell's non-fiction, and I really loved how he included this, or how he interwove this, or his ability of political writing in this novel. So I think the strongest part of this very eerie and very realistic book was the part about where it had like little excerpts of the book. The book is basically a feature, or like the book is actually a real book in this world, and it had excerpts included in this one, so obviously they were fictional, but you could really see George Orwell's potential as a writer about, or a non-fiction writer about politics, about his potential as an essayist. So I've written strongest part is the book chapters. Orwell shines with his political non-fiction. So yeah, definitely I enjoyed these the most. I'm probably the only person. Everybody else would have just said, oh please go on with the story, I don't want to read what is written in this book. But yeah, what else did I note? Interesting in the concept of time. It was written in 1948. This set in 1984, which was obviously the future for Orwell, but which is now for us in 2020 the past. So it is basically Orwell's history of the past future, because he talks about the 60s and what happens in the 60s and 70s. Orwell's history of the past future, the 60s, as an alternative history to a current or contemporary reader of this book. So he has written this in 1948, got published in 1949. It was about how he speculated about a future in 1984. In 1984, those people obviously have a history of the 60s and 50s and 70s, which would have still been Orwell's future, which for us as a reader now in 2020 is obviously our past and gives us an alternative history. So I just love that. I love that book so much. I'm really interested in rereading that, and really interested in reading academic texts around this book again. And also I really want to read more by George Orwell, everything by George Orwell. He's amazing. Inspired by the thought police in George Orwell, I read Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police, which was released in 1994, got recently translated into English for the first time, and is now, is it long-listed or short-listed for, well, it basically got nominated for the International Booker Prize, which is great because I love this book. This is set on an unnamed island where objects, things, thoughts disappear. One day people wake up and they don't have any use for plants anymore, for mugs, for television sets. They take them, they burn them, they lose their memory of them. But there are also people who can still remember, which the memory police, they want to find those people and eliminate them. The protagonist of this book, she's an author, and she discovers her editor is one of the few people who can still remember. She hides him. So there again you have like the start of reading this book under so many different aspects. Also, if you take in like historical accounts, there's also a scene, if you don't want to get spoiled, if you don't want to get spoiled right now, just mute me for maybe a minute. But there is a scene where there are burning books, burning libraries. The writer gets into the situation where she can't memorize books again anymore because books get banned, books get taken out of their world basically. She is in the process of writing a book, and it talks about this process of her still trying to work on her novel with the help of her editor as somebody who can't remember novels anymore. And I thought this was so powerful, and this was like my most favorite part of the whole book. Just amazing. And obviously it starts making you think about so many other stories, fictional and non-fictional, that happened in history and in fiction, where books were banned, where books were burned. So yeah, this is really, I hope it's going to win. I really hope it's going to win the International Booker. My camera just, did it die? It did not die, no, but it just stopped filming because I'm talking for so long now. Okay, I maybe have to hurry, but I have 4 more books to go through. So The Memory Police was the last book I talked about, and this sparked my interest in Asian literature. So I picked up a book that just got released, which is Kim Joo Young, I don't know how to pronounce it, Born 1982 by Joo Young, which is this one here, which is about Kim Joo Young, born in 1982. It is a life story of one young woman born at the end of the 20th century who raises questions about endemic misogyny and institutional oppression that are relevant to us all. So this woman, it's basically the story of her from being, it starts of her starting to act weird. She starts to lose her own personality, or dissociate herself with her own body and her own personality, and takes on different personalities. It is then taking back the reader into the history of the character, when she was a girl, when she was a teenager, when she got married, and when she got her first child, and then basically goes back into the contemporary current timeline. This book was so depressing, but so realistic. It gives an impression of Korean society that I never thought of in that way. I know nothing about Asian societies, to be honest. Like my knowledge on that is so minimal. How that society was portrayed, I was really shocked by it because I didn't know about that. Like how oppressed women are. It was just disgusting to read, seriously disgusting. When I was reading this, I was so disgusted throughout reading this book. I was so shocked. So in the end, although it is about Kim Joo Young, this individual person, in the end she becomes every woman with her personality disorder she has at the end, and the end is very interesting. Like, I don't want to spoil this book, but if you read the end, it's like you get the idea of being stuck in a vicious circle and being a woman in a heteronormative world ruled by men. So eerie and so real, sadly. It includes footnotes, which is really interesting. So it is a novel, a fictional book, but it includes references and quotes to research studies on Korean society, on women in jobs, women as mothers, and all sorts of things. And so that makes this book read, and also this character being an example, and turns Kim Joo Young into every woman again, and not only her personal story. So very interesting. I'm kind of rushing through right now because my camera turned off. That kind of puts me a bit under pressure right now. So this book deserves more more rational thoughts on it now, not just my hushed thoughts right now. But yeah, if you have the opportunity to read it, it's very short. It just has 160 pages, so please read this book. Very important book. Then let's come to my last books. Yeah, my last 3 books. So I read Recursion by Black Crouch, which is a speculative or science fictional novel about a disease that some people start to get. They get like false memories, so it's called false memory syndrome, and it's about one detective who starts working on a case of somebody who jumped to their death because of false memory syndrome. And there he gets into connection with a scientist who works on something that includes preserving memories. But then there's also obviously a counterpart who has their own reason to misuse certain technology, and yeah, so I thought it was very inventive. It was no nonsense novel. It wasn't too long. It was entertaining. I think I want to read more by him. He has written the Wayward Pines novels, which I enjoyed as a teleseries on Amazon, I think it was. Yeah, it had a bit of a too happy end for my liking. It was okay. I enjoyed reading it, but it's nothing where I would say, oh, that is going to change the world or change my mind, or I don't know what. It was very inventive, very nice, a very good read. So everybody who's into science fiction and wants a good book to entertain, this is a one. Another speculative fiction one I read is Helen Marshall's The Migration, which is also taking place around a disease that infects younger people. I talked about this already in my book haul, where I hauled this book basically. It is about this girl who moves to the UK from Canada because her sister is ill from that disease. There isn't any cure yet. They're working on it. They don't fully understand this disease yet. They're moving in with their aunt, who is a researcher at the university that is also linked to the hospital where the sister gets treated and all of that. And our protagonist becomes involved in the research, where she and her aunt discover links of that disease to the plague and other diseases in or during history. The story is also set in a world where there is the climate catastrophe massively happening, so they're always in danger. There's always lots of storms, flooding. They don't have enough food. So there are two major dangers basically happening: this mysterious disease and also the climate catastrophe, which are both things that are quite relevant at the moment, aren't they? With that disease, it explores this disease, and the reader gets to know what happens in the end with everybody who's infected to that. So there's a very big mystery aspect around it, and it really goes quite dark at a point. But it keeps a certain mystery aspect, which I quite liked. But then also again, it was a bit too fantastic and a bit too mystery for my liking. I would have enjoyed it being a bit more scientific, basically. Yeah, I basically liked the narrative. It gave thoughts about mortality, makes you think about climate change and climate catastrophe at the moment, makes you think about spreading diseases at the moment. Yeah, it was a good read. And then the last book I read was Sympathy by Olivia, which is about a 23-year-old Alice Hare who arrives in New York, living with her grandmother, I think, and she gets obsessed with a female Japanese writer. Let's just read my notes I've taken to that one. It is about experience oneself in different places, which, yes, she arrives in. She was born in America, I think. She got adopted by a couple. After a while they moved to Japan, then they moved to the UK, and now she moves back to America, basically. So it's about coming to terms with your own identity in different countries, in different places. I've written down it is comparable to Sally Rooney, which was called The Voice of a Generation. So I would say Olivia Suchik plays into this Voice of Generation too. I know there was lots of controversy about it because it only gives a glimpse in a certain part of a generation, and I'm fine with that, but I think she is part of this group of voices of a generation. And yeah, if you like Sally Rooney's books, I think you would really much enjoy this one. The Observer called it Alice Through the Looking Glass for the Instagram generation. I don't like the term Instagram generation in that instance. It has a lot of references to a photo app, and Alice becomes quite a stalker, stalking the Japanese author's life on the internet, but wouldn't go as far as to call people who use Instagram an Instagram generation. I don't know. Yeah, and in the end it's about constructing a self. It's about an unreliable narrator who's also a writer, so yeah. I'm a bit out of breath at the moment, I'm a bit out of my depths at the moment after talking about over an hour. So please excuse me, dear Olivia Suchik. I very much enjoyed this book. I can really recommend it to everyone who likes Sally Rooney's books, or likes books about people their own age. Like if you're kind of my age, if you're in your 20s and 30s, maybe you really would enjoy this one too. Yeah. Oh, the sun comes around now. And that was my massive wrap up. So I think in the future, if I still continue to read those masses, I'm gonna split up my wrap up, because also this camera cat kind of threw me out a bit, if you can't tell. Okay, let me know what you've read, and otherwise we see each other next week again. And yeah, happy reading. Hey guys, just a little disclaimer, just a little epilogue. I just came up with an idea. I thought instead of making a wrap up every 2 weeks, I could do a little reading update on my Instagram, like maybe every time I finished a book, or maybe after every weekend, something like that. So if you don't want to sit through an hour or 2 hour long video at the end of the month, you can just pop onto my Instagram and look out for some reading updates over there. So that will also be something new for me. I've never made an IGTV video before, so I think that could be quite fun. I'll link my Instagram down below, so yeah, hope to see you there soon. Until then, happy reading again.